In February 467 AD, Rome welcomed a new emperor named Flavius Procopius Anthemius, who, after long negotiations with Constantinople, arrived with a large and lavish retinue, accompanied by the governor of Illyria, already known to us, Marcellinus, and his army. The favorite of the Emperor Leo was met not far from the walls of the city, and immediately with a crowd of people the Senate and the army officially produced in the emperor. Anthemius previously lived in the eastern part of the empire. He was married to the daughter of Emperor Marcian, and for a long time served as commander-in-chief. Under Emperor Leo, he continued to command the army and distinguished himself in the defense of the empire in the Balkans, repelling the plundering campaigns of the Ostrogoths and the last raid of the Huns under the leadership of one of Attila's sons. An imperial commander meant preparations for war. There was little doubt that the Romans and Greeks had finally agreed to act together against the Vandals. The annual plundering raids of the Vandal fleet ravaged not only the lands of Rome, but had already reached the Peloponnese in Greece and the islands of the Aegean Sea, so that the solution of this problem was vital to the existence of the entire empire. Soon Ricimer, as a participant of the plan, received his part of this great deal: marriage with the only daughter of the new emperor, Illyria. The wedding was celebrated with unprecedented festivities. The only ones who almost immediately expressed doubts about the emperor were the clergy. The new Pope Galerius, who replaced Leo the Great, generally continued the work of his great predecessor. Strictly monitored that Rome controlled all the bishoprics in the provinces. The arrival of the well-known heretic Philotheus in Anthemius's entourage did not escape Galerius. Nevertheless, Anthemius preferred to issue a decree of religious toleration, and Galerius, already approaching his deathbed, could only beg him not to allow one of the Eastern heresies to reign in Rome. Unanimously elected new Pope Simplicius was a fierce opponent of the established in the East Caesaropapism, and believed that the emperor should not get involved in spiritual matters in general. A conflict was looming, but before it grew into an open confrontation, there were events that pushed everything else into the background. Anthemius did not disperse his forces into Spain and Gaul, allowing these provinces to live their own lives for the time being. Shortly before his accession, the Visigothic king Theodoric II was killed in Toulouse. He had once killed his older brother. Now he was killed by the youngest of his brothers, Geiserich. The new king of the Visigoths was not going to blindly follow the policy of Rome and was an advocate of an independent policy. He began negotiations, sent embassies to all neighbors, but has not yet taken any action, waiting for the results of the campaign against the Vandals. In the meantime, the great campaign against Geiserich began. According to the plan, the Roman commander Marcellinus and his fleet from Illyria were again tasked with clearing Sicily and Sardinia. Then a large fleet from Byzantium was to strike directly at Carthage. Marcellinus repeated what he had already done once before. With his fleet and army, he appeared near Sicily, cleansed the island of the Vandal presence, left his garrison behind, and sternly ordered not to sell out to Ricimer as he had done the last time. Next, Sardinia was captured, though the Vandals never seriously occupied the islands, taxing them solely by right of sole lord at sea. Having stopped on Sardinia, the leader of army of the Western Roman Empire, Marcellinus, has faced the large-scale conspiracy behind which stood Ricimer. The restless schemer had too many connections and influence, so Marcellinus had to flee to Sicily, where he, too, faced treason. During an argument with one of his commanders, Marcellinus was killed, and thus the campaign of the army of Rome fell apart. In the same days, a fleet of Eastern generals arrived at the coast of Africa. While the Greek army was landing and settling in a few dozen kilometers from Carthage, Geiserich proposed a truce and negotiations. Having received consent, the Vandal took advantage of this ploy and prepared an attack on the huddled invasion fleet by means of a brander. After this blow, some of the invasion fleet was burned, the Byzantine commander Basil decided to retreat and regroup in Sicily. Having loaded back the army, he sailed to the island where he learned that Marcellinus had been killed and the army of the western half of the empire was incapacitated. Having judged that the campaign had failed, the Byzantines sailed eastward, thus signing another shameful defeat and inability to fight against the Vandals. The second act of the humiliating history of the struggle between Anthemius and the barbarians came. Having made sure that the empire was unable to cope with the Vandals, the Goths went on the offensive. Kingdom of the Visigoths. Eric, already to the beginning of his reign, was the strongest of the European barbarian states formed in the 5th century. Last 10 years, Visigoths probed the defense of neighbors who had to combine all their efforts to repel the numerous Gothic army. By bartering territories from Roman emperors for favors, the Visigoths had already gained access to the sea and were approaching Orleans and Arles. In 468, Eric began open expansion in Gaul. Anticipating the defeat of the empire, the prefect of Gaul Arvand openly defected to the side of the Visigoths. Beginning with the defeat of the Bretons, Eric again faced the combined forces of the Franks, the Burgundians, the retreating Bretons, and the northern commander Paul the Comite, who governed the region of Soissons. Stopping at the natural border, the river Loire, Eric turned south and struck southern Gaul. Here the Goths spread as far as the Rhone River. In 471, for the last time in history, a Roman army crossed the Alps and entered Gaul to contain the Visigoths. In early summer, there was a battle in which Ericus, having already crossed the Rhone at the head, defeated the emperor's army, destroyed all his commanders, and killed his son Anthemius. Further success of the Visigoths were able to buy activated Burgundians, but all the influence of the empire beyond the Alps was lost forever. The loss of Arles became a matter of time, and the main question was who it would go to, the Goths or the Burgundians. Meanwhile, in the east, the kleptocratic regime of Leo Macella tried to solve the problem of the Ostgoths. After the collapse of the Hun Empire, many barbarian tribes beyond the Danube gained independence, and some even formed their own kingdoms. The Ostgoths, who migrated en masse to Pannonia under Marcian, were the most numerous and strongest of these states. Traditionally, the Ostgoths were on good terms with Constantinople, making a treaty of federates and serving as mercenaries for the empire. When Emperor Leo stopped paying them with grain and gold, they ruined and captured a part of the province of Illyria in a few years, after which they forced the emperor to buy their loyalty in exchange for grain and gold. Past 15 years after Attila's death, threat of Hun's return disappeared, and former allies jointly defended independence in the battle at Nidau, finally quarreled. The Ostgoths were too strong and began to threaten the existence of the small independent tribes of the Germans. A small conflict between the eastern Svevians and the Ostgoths quickly escalated into a major war, with many other Germans joining the Svevians and their allies, the Syrians. The Byzantine army also came to the aid of the united armies of the free Germanic tribes, but it did not have time to participate in the Battle of Bolia, in which the Ostgoth king Theodemir defeated the alliance of free peoples. The triumph of the Ostgoths led to a massive flight of Germanics from the forests of Eastern Europe. For example, the remnants of the Syrians, led by Odoacer, the son of the king killed in battle, soon appeared in Italy and entered the service of the emperor's army. A new wave of migration of the Germans, who feared the threat of the Ostgoths, washed out the remaining military aristocracy of the Germans from northeastern Europe, and from the depths of the forests to the border of the Ostgoths moved the last of the Germanic tribes, Lombards, a people even more savage than the rest of the savage Germans. Behind the Lombards were formed already purely Slavic tribes. As a result, Byzantium could not support the balance of barbarian kingdoms, and on its border appeared a strong Ostgothic kingdom. As for Italy, then, alas, after a series of defeats, quickly became clear that the author of Anthemius held solely on the dreams of the Romans about the return of Africa. In the area that remained under his rule, of course Sicily and Sardinia were immediately seized back by the Vandals, and Illyria had its own new ruler, Nepotus. There was only one full ruler, Ricimer. The few forces that were loyal to the emperor could not resist the barbarian, but he still tried to free himself from the yoke of his all-powerful minister and son-in-law. Not waiting for the emperor, who was a successful commander, to gather enough forces to fight, Ricimer struck first. Openly starting a quarrel with the emperor, he retreated to Milan, where he began to collect loyal to himself detachments of the Germans. Attempts to reconcile them with the help of the bishops seemed to be successful, But after all the assurances and oaths, Ricimer, calling the army of his nephew Gundobad from Burgundy, marched south and laid siege to Rome. The courageous Anthemius led the defense. Not only did he have a small force, there were many Arian soldiers in the city who openly sympathized with Ricimer. Besides, Ricimer, a couple of years after his defeat in the war with the Vandals, held his own negotiations and agreed to recognize as emperor a pretender from Geiserich, Olybrius. This husband, married to the daughter of Eudoxia, I hope you remember her, named Placidia, through his wife was the only legitimate heir to the descendants of Theodosius. He came from Byzantium and joined the siege that soon spawned famine and an outbreak of plague in Rome. At the moment when the besiegers occupied part of the wall and took possession of part of the city, the emperor, now defending the bridge over the Tiber, was already thinking of surrendering, but then he was aided by the Gothic commander Bellimer, who, flattered by the promise of titles and power, brought his band of barbarians from Gaul and entered the battle to lift the siege. A battle ensued, in which Bellimer fell, and Ricimer seized Hadrian's Gate and stormed the remainder of the city. A mixture of many Aryan Germanic tribes stormed the long-suffering city. The barbarians got Rome for total plunder. Exception was given to those areas that had been occupied even before the battle. For the luck of the Pope, the Vatican was just among the spared parts of the city. The third brutal looting of the city this time was accompanied by fires and murders. Emperor Anthemius was found hiding in a church. Having chopped the unfortunate man to pieces, Ricimer handed the diadem of rule to Olybrius, who just a short time before had also been recognized by the Eastern Emperor Leo Masella.